Welcome to the Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is my regular co-host, Cleveland area attorney and Republican factotum, Jay Carson.
Good morning, Mike.
Morning, Jay. How are you this morning?
I'm good. This has been a fun week. I mean, you could say good or bad, but
It's been interesting. Yeah, interesting. That's the word I keep on coming back to. Yeah, well, before we get to, I think, the sort of, well, really particularly whodunit sort of story, let's start by talking about the Supreme Court confirmation hearings for Judge Brett Kavanaugh. I'd say that things went really more or less as expected. Because most Senate Republicans tossed out what seemed to me to be softball questions. Though there were, a few expressions of concern about Kavanaugh's views on executive power, which I appreciated hearing. And of course, Democrats tried to get Kavanaugh to comment on substantive legal issues, which, like pretty much every nominee, he artfully dodged and evaded. I mean, that's been the rule for the last few decades.
Well, and properly so.
Yeah, well, and we can talk a little bit about what's proper evasion and what's just saying nothing, but. The other thing I wanted to point out is, of course, a number of Democrats expressed, I guess you'd call it outrage over the process, particularly that committee confidential classification of just about 200,000 pages of documents that were related to Kavanaugh's time as staff secretary in the George W. Bush administration. Then in addition to that, there were 100,000 more pages of documents that weren't even available to the Judiciary Committee, because the Trump administration has claimed they're protected by executive privilege. Now, some of those committee confidential documents have been released to the public this week. This was at the request of Democratic senators. But that, of course, doesn't really address, I don't think, the Democrats' more fundamental argument that these hearings are being essentially rammed through by Republicans who are pretty anxious to confirm Kavanaugh in time for the start of the court's term, which is October 1st. So I think that pretty much brings us up to date. Jay, what's your take on what we've seen this week?
You didn't even mention Spartacus.
I figured you would probably mention that.
Will.
Yeah, absolutely.
Look, I think that might be a what would you call it? A legitimate argument. If the folks like Cory Booker and Kamala Harris and Dick Durbin were sort of sitting there thinking, man, I'm really on the fence with this guy. If only I had more to see about his record, then I might be able to make up my mind. But obviously that's not the case. I mean, you and I have talked for a couple weeks ago about how this stuff that they're looking for from the Bush administration wouldn't reflect any of his legal opinions, legal reasoning, his opinion at all. He was sort of the scribe, essentially, for the committee, and would have done some editing, putting, sort of summaries and recommendations together. But what they're looking for is some gotcha piece to try to, run and in the case of, I would say, Booker and Harris, promote their own candidacy for president. So I think it's a little disingenuous when you look at the amount of documents that have been produced compared to other Supreme Court nominees. It's staggering. I mean, there is I've read that the number of documents produced for the Kavanaugh hearings is more than the last five Supreme Court nominees combined. Now, you can make an argument, well, there's probably more out there just because stuff's stored electronically now, and he had this role as the secretary in the Bush administration, so that would generate more stuff. But look, when it comes down to it, what really matters is his written opinions. That's where you're going to see an expression of his judicial philosophy, and that's what's gonna that's what ought to be being examined, to the extent that his qualifications are not in question. So I think it's pretty disingenuous, and a lot of histrionics from the Democrats, and most, again, the Cory Booker thing is absolutely hilarious, where certain emails were cleared for or certain documents, I should say, were cleared for committee use, which was, if you're the folks who say, okay, yeah, we'll give you all these documents, but you got to keep them confidential to the committee. Them's the rules, unless they're cleared otherwise. And Cory Booker grandstanded and went out and said he's releasing these documents courageously in violation of the rules, because he is Spartacus. This is sort of his Spartacus moment, which is going to be so much fun with the campaign signs in 2020. Then of course those emails or those documents were then actually cleared. They had been cleared. They were in the pipeline for being cleared when he did all this, and they sort of amounted to a big, there was nothing particularly spectacular one way or the other. Kavanaugh had sort of an anodyne statement on racial profiling, and that profiling should be is necessary to some extent, but race should be limited. I mean, I don't know. To me, that it's sort of I think the Democrats on the committee, they're playing to the base, and I get that, but it's not going to make a difference, and I think they're making themselves look silly to the general electorate.
Well, I'm going to agree with you on almost everything.
Good.
Almost everything.
Okay.
You're certainly right that everyone's mind is made up. I think you're certainly right that, you can even question why we have hearings aside from just essentially this sort of grandstanding
yes, I will question
opportunities.
That, so, yeah.
And I should point out that we haven't always had hearings. They only started, but back in 1939, they used to be essentially, there were still hearings, but they weren't public, basically. But I think even though granting just about everything you've said, I still think that the fundamental argument about respecting the process is important and should be honored, even if it's hypocritical because they're just looking for gotcha things. I don't disagree with that. I think both sides do that. But I think that if these documents are going to be, examined and be considered at least, looking, I'll say this, that there were these 200,000 pages of documents that were released to the committee. If you're going to do that, then I think you need to give the committee enough time to reasonably look over them. Whatever their reasons are, I don't think that's material. What I think is material, especially in a time where everyone seems to be willing to jettison process to get to their preferred political outcomes, that we need to respect this process. And if these documents are going to be part of the process, then it seems to me to be only right that there be enough time to fairly review them, even if that's not going to change anything. And so that's my position on that.
Well, how much time would you give them? I mean, because here's the game, of course, and Republicans to some extent, shame on them. And this is I wanted to look on the Cory Booker thing and the Senate rule violation bit, even though it turned out it wouldn't actually be a rule violation because then it was okayed. It was sort of okay in the pipeline, but it's sort of a thing of this is how you get Trump. If you're going to say, okay, here's all these documents, but please, these are confidential to the committee. Okay, he runs out and says, and he's going to make them unconfidential. At that point, you're like, come on, man.
I don't disagree with that, Jay. What I'm saying though is that the process. If these documents are there, and they are, the committee was given hundreds of thousands of pages of documents. And the idea that, for instance, the Republicans would dump, 40, 50,000 pages, right at the very end of the process and say, oh yeah, everyone's had a chance to look them over. I mean, that's just simply ludicrous. So if you're going to,
we read much faster than
people. Exactly. So I really think that at least on that final point, even if they're being disingenuous, which again, I think both sides in this are, that we need to respect the process. I think process is something that is not honored nearly enough on that. But speaking of process, I wanted to ask you about the Senate confirmation process. I mean, again, my sense of it is the whole public hearing thing is largely pointless at this point. I don't see that it serves any real purpose. What do you think?
Well, I mean, no, any real purpose in terms of trying to determine whether this nominee ought to be on the court. No. Does it serve a political purpose for everybody sitting in the committee to
Sure.
grandstand? Yes. And thinking back, and again, I'm trying to think back of other um, Senate confirmations or judiciary confirmation. I'm hearing the first one I remember was Judge Bork. Um, and look, I was like 16 or something, so it's not like I was like necessarily glued to the TV. But I probably had a bigger awareness of it than most of my peers. And that was the first, again, that I remember that there was this, the big gotcha attack that was sort of launched by Ted Kennedy. Um, Even, I mean, I think Scalia before him, I don't think faced that kind of
No, he was
ideological.
confirmed by something like 90,
Yeah,
96 votes or something like that to 96 to 4 or something like that. But
yeah. So to me, I mean, it seems like the process, the reason for the confirmation hearings used to be sort of a more just here's an introduction of our nominee. Get to know them. Hope you like them. And you do sort of the basic look. Does this guy have the qualifications to be a Supreme Court justice? And I would say, of all of the nominees that have been out there, I would say that's pretty strong. I mean, I think there's a case of like remember Harriet Miers.
mhm.
That was sort of. I mean, I think she was look, was she qualified to be a Supreme Court justice? I don't know, maybe, but she didn't certainly have the resume that Brett Kavanaugh had, or even a Merrick Garland, uh, name your other
Sure.
justices. So look, I think that's a fair thing of look, let's look into what they did on the district or appellate courts, or what they've written as a law professor or whatever, but. Um, it used to be sort of a baseline. Does this guy have what it takes to do the job? Does this guy or woman have what it takes to do the job? And sort of let's get introduce him to the American people to some extent. And then it changed in 1987.
Yeah, and certainly both sides. I think you would be willing to admit that both sides do it because this is sort of a bipartisan political grandstanding. It just depends on
Yeah.
who is. Yeah, you seem a little reluctant. I mean,
Well, no,
the Republicans
but
wouldn't even give Barack Obama's nominee a hearing. So both
right.
sides do it, Jay.
But let's look at those. Let's look at the hearings um, of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Um, and Obama's other nominee. We got to do this show later in the day.
Well, no, I mean, I don't really want. I mean, I don't think we
Thank
should. I don't think there's any point in getting into a who did what to whom first. I
right.
mean, the point is that this is something that this has become political theater. This has become grandstanding from both parties, and regardless of who the nominee is, the people of that party ask these questions. So, can you tell me why you're such a great American, and talk about your
Sure.
work with the poor and helpless and all that? And the other side, clearly is just looking for gotchas essentially, and that's just how
Well,
the
and
game
let
is
me
played.
though point that some extent the ridiculousness to which it's raised. There was a Jonah Goldberg piece talking about. If you heard about this, the Kavanaugh law clerk with the alleged white power hand symbol.
I am happy to say that I have not heard about that
Yes, well, this
ridiculousness.
came out of sort of, and I'm not going to ascribe this to the sort of the typical Democrat Party. It was sort of the fever swamps of the left. But in watching the video, someone hypothesized that the way that this former law clerk was holding her hands was some sort of white power symbol that was being secretly transmitted, therefore, to all the Klansmen who were glued to the TV watching this.
Yeah, there are
Um,
people with too
and
much time on their hands, I
and
think.
and again would then I guess contact their senators and ask them to affirm Kavanaugh. Um, but I mean, just the absolute ridiculousness of this when one also considers that this law clerk was of Mexican heritage, born in Mexico. She's married to a Jewish man. Um, Again, it's and I think also some of the statements just again that people will die if Kavanaugh is nominated. Uh,
Or if he's not, I'm pretty sure people will die either
well,
way.
no,
But
I think people. Well, right. But
yeah,
I mean, it's people will die because he's nominated. Is sort of the implication. Um, it just really, I think, strikes a lot of average Americans as, again, when he's, come on, man. Um, so it plays well to the base, but I think
On both sides, yeah. Well,
yeah,
I think the one thing we know is that Brett Kavanaugh will be almost certainly will be confirmed sometime before October 1st, and he will be the ninth justice on the court when it starts
I
its
think
new
so.
term on October
Yes,
1st.
unless
That's
you were to
very.
like go to a Klan rally next week or something like that, which I doubt.
He might lose a few
You know,
votes. Yeah, he'd go down the narrow defeat or something. I don't know. But anyway, let's move on and talk about I think the story that sort of everyone talking this week. And I want to start by saying that for really I think the entirety of Donald Trump's presidency, we've been reading and hearing accounts of reckless impulsiveness, paranoia, downright chaos in the administration from
as far
all
as the
sorts of
paranoia,
people.
can you blame him?
Oh yeah. A lot of people should be out to get him, I think. But the consistent theme is that all of this emanates from Donald Trump himself. He is the master of chaos, and there have been countless stories about how various administration officials have been trying to manage him or work around the president, that sort of thing. And so, in one sense, the leaking of those passages from Bob Woodward's upcoming book on the Trump administration and that anonymous op-ed in the New York Times about a resistance inside the administration, they're not, in a sense, all that surprising. But in another sense, this can be seen, I think, as a pretty big deal. I mean, for one thing, Bob Woodward isn't just some journalist, any guy, right? I mean,
Right.
he's been sort of like the gold standard chronicler of presidencies from Nixon on. He's written multiple books on the Clinton, Bush, and
Pretty
Obama
much everything.
presidencies.
Yeah.
Everyone talks to Bob Woodward. I mean, I don't think
Yes.
there's anyone who has more access. And if there's a more sort of mainstream respected political journalist slash author in the country, I don't know who it is. But it's not like there's anything truly new here. But I think that because he has this reputation for incredibly meticulous reporting and fair reporting, at least again in mainstream, I think that elevates these sort of piecemeal things that we've heard. But again, nothing really new.
Right.
But then
Well,
go ahead.
I will interject though.
Okay,
Some of
yeah.
the stuff that on the Woodward stuff, for example, they're saying there are quotes of Kelly saying that Trump is an idiot. Mattis making similar statements, and these cabinet officials have denied making those statements. And to me, that strikes me as, I don't know enough about where this was sourced. But if certainly General Kelly, I don't think sat down with an interview with Bob Woodward and said, "Let me tell you, Bob, on the record,
No, of course not.
the president's an idiot."
And just to be
Again,
clear,
and I don't think Bob Woodward would just make up a quote from General Kelly. And I would expect that if he had a quote from General Kelly from someone else, he would verify it with him. And that's what's a little concerning to me, that some of this just doesn't seem to match up. Now,
well,
again, you could,
somebody's lying. I mean,
yeah,
and I would think that what Woodward is known for, among other things, is checking things through multiple sources. So he does not have a reputation for publishing things as factually occurring if he did not get confirmation from multiple sources.
right.
And so
the problem, of course, is still the whole anonymous source bit.
sure, and that's I mean, there's of course a long tradition of that goes back to the founding of of the country. So this idea that there's something inherently questionable about anonymous sources, well, then I think that's sort of ridiculous. But okay, but then there's that that bombshell New York Times op-ed piece from an anonymous source that the Times characterized as a senior official in the Trump administration, where the author said that there are many senior officials working to, while they like a lot of the policies of the administration, at the same time they're working to, in the words of the author, frustrate parts of President Trump's agenda, as well as kind of mute his worst inclinations. And then he mentions at the beginning, he or she mentions at the beginning of the presidency, there were even some whispers within the cabinet, very specifically within the cabinet,
Yes.
about potentially invoking the 25th Amendment but they decided they didn't want to precipitate a constitutional crisis. And so they said, well, we'll just essentially work around the president where we feel like he's got some really bad ideas.
Right.
I mean, would that be a fair characterization of that?
It's a pretty good characterization.
Okay. Now that I think is something a little different. For one thing, that whole idea of, well, we didn't want to precipitate a constitutional crisis. I would argue, as a number of people pointed out, that's exactly what you're doing if you're working around the, the democratically elected president of the United States.
And if there is a constitutional process for removing him, well, it's not a constitutional crisis that's using the Constitution.
Right, exactly. And as people kind of throw that term around, but really it would just be a extraordinarily big deal, but not a constitutional crisis. Yeah, essentially. So, and just to be clear, I wanted to talk about that 25th Amendment issue. For people who don't know, I mean, Senator Elizabeth Warren came out saying that, well, it seems like maybe it's time to invoke the 25th Amendment. And I think it's important to actually, I don't know how many people have actually read the 25th Amendment. I did this week. I reread it.
I read it. I didn't read it this week.
Well, I read it in fact, I read it yesterday. And the 25th Amendment applies when the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. Now, Donald Trump is not unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office. He's just discharging them in a way that a lot of people find repugnant, me among them. But that's different than saying that he can't do that. He's somehow incapacitated and can't do these things. He's just doing a lot of things I think are really awful, as do apparently even some people inside his administration. But that doesn't mean he can be removed for that reason. So I don't even think the 25th Amendment applies here. Jay, what's your thought on that?
Well, apparently needed the cabinet. Absolutely, I agree. I mean, look, if there is, and people have pointed this out about the op-ed writer, if there is actual evidence that Trump is somehow out of touch with reality, right? I mean, dangerously, I mean, mentally ill, not just he's making bad decisions they don't like, or is impulsive. But if, he wakes up tomorrow and says, let's nuke Finland, something like
absolutely.
that. In that kind of case, I think you could say his mental capacity is such, or such that he's not able to discharge his duties. I don't see. Look, he's getting stuff done, and maybe you don't like it. Maybe it's certainly frustrating to work with him. But that's not a cause for essentially overturning an election.
Yeah.
On the go ahead.
No, I was going to say, on the issue of, well, is this a real high-ranking official? I think the answer to that is almost certainly yes. This name is going to eventually come out. There's been a furious effort to find out who this is, and it seems almost certain that at some point this person is going to be the name of this person is going to be revealed. And the New York Times isn't going to risk its reputation by essentially lying about this. So this isn't some low-level staffer. This is somebody who is prominent in the administration, because this is going to come out. Now the president is saying that the Department of Justice should investigate it, which the Department of Justice has no legal authority to do. So that's just Donald Trump being Donald Trump and not understanding, the law. Actually,
there would be. I mean, there would be. First of all, I would say yes. First blush, I would say it's this isn't a Department of Justice thing. It's a White House HR department sort of thing. But to the extent that if you've got someone out there who is actively this adverse, I mean, I think there could be issues with security and so forth. I mean, presumably you screen these people when they come in. And I think this could give rise to concern about, look, I mean, should Omarosa have had a security clearance and been able to do what she was doing? No, absolutely not. So I don't know. I would disagree. Okay, go ahead.
I was going to say, on the Omarosa thing, I think that's, we can certainly say, or a lot of people certainly would argue that the president is guilty of spectacularly bad personnel judgment. But again, that doesn't mean that he's incapacitated. That may be a tragedy for the country. But there is, as far as I can tell, there is only one constitutionally legitimate way to do anything about this, and that is through the impeachment and conviction process that's laid out in the Constitution, not the 25th Amendment. That doesn't apply here. So if these things are raised to this level, I would say, and there have been a number of conservative critics I've noticed who've said the same thing, and I'll agree with them that this person should, in fact, speak out publicly. And there needs to be some sort of documentation backing up of this, because if Donald Trump is in this bad of a state, then he or she, this person, owes it to the American public, to the country, to come out with this. And it's sort of sad. I guess, there's been a lot of talk about the motives of the author. And I would say, maybe this is what happens when, for decades, generations maybe even, you have a culture that says, well, you know what, the most important thing here is me. And I'd sure like to help, but it's job security before country, certainly.
Well, and I thought this was actually kind of funny. Again, the New York Times said that they were publishing this piece anonymously, and this is that they took great pains in trying to determine whether or not they should publish it anonymously.
Sure.
Because they thought they needed to protect this person's job. And that struck me like, seriously?
Well, I disagree, because that's the call. I'm sure that the person who wrote it and under the conditions that it could only be published if, and so I think the Times just waited on that basis. So they don't really have a choice in the matter. They're not going to reveal their sources, but it's up to
their choices. They can say, no, we're not going to publish it.
Sure, but no, I think it was important to publish. I think they did the right thing in publishing it, because with any luck, that will lead to this person revealing him or herself and lead to some serious consideration of these issues.
If that were the situation, then why doesn't the Times just tell us who it is?
Because newspapers, journalists don't reveal their sources just because they think it would be.
There's also sort of the irony of their New York Times reporters trying to determine who the anonymous source is that the New York Times published.
That should make you feel good. That suggests that they're very serious about this sort of thing, that there is this wall of separation between the news operation and the editorial operation. That's how it should be, Jay.
It should be, and it should absolutely. There should be a wall between the editorial operation and the news operation. Yeah. I agree.
And I think I want to say that this is it's not the failing New York Times. The New York Times, just like the Wall Street Journal, I would argue on the other side, they take that seriously. And I think that's great. And that's why I salute. I think that the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post are three of the most valuable resources we have in the media in this country. And I think it's just such an incredible disaster that the president has no problems denigrating them for his own personal gain.
Let me ask you this, though. Wouldn't it be incumbent upon these guardians of our democracy too, if there is this talk that there is a fifth column at work inside the Trump administration trying to overturn the president's wishes, there should be a massive investigation into this, right?
Absolutely.
Who else is in it? Who else is involved? Who else is defying presidential orders?
Yep.
That's a big deal. You're not really seeing that. And second, I think
we don't know if we're now. Let me push back on that before you move on to your second point. We don't know what sort of an investigation there is about this in the media. So let's not. We can't make that conclusion yet. I'm sure that there are plenty of people who are scrambling to try to corroborate some of this, but obviously, just due to the nature of the story, it's difficult to do. So I wanted to just disagree with you on that first point, but go ahead.
All right. So I'm going to disagree with you very much on the source of this. You and I, we can even come up with some kind of wager, if you will. I do not think it's going to be some sort of senior level, high level cabinet official. My guess is when and if this comes out, it's going to be someone like the assistant to the deputy undersecretary, for wetlands preservation. It's not that I'm trying to out that person if there's, but I think it's going to be someone who works in the administration whose title has perhaps been stretched to say senior administration official. At which point the New York Times will be embarrassed, and then will walk back and come up with the well, yes, but it's still all true anyway, type response. And I think you're kind of premising this on the idea that look, it's important to publish this because it must come from someone in a high up position. And again, I haven't seen that premise because there's nothing in the op-ed, for example, that would indicate that this person has some sort of real knowledge of things that are going on. It's not even as precise or documented as the Woodward book. Someone could have read a bunch of op-eds of just other things here and there and written this, and it's chaos. It's chaos. People are trying to keep them, from doing dumb stuff. And to some extent, there's also, look, in any job you've got, right? If you're an assistant to someone, your job is to try to prevent them from, it's to carry out their orders, but it's also to try to prevent them from stepping on their own feet. And then I'm sure there's times where, you try to steer stuff, but there's a big difference between advising and trying to override a decision.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, as to your bet, I would take it under the condition that we sort of stipulate what what constitutes,
Sure.
because I think there are going to be some people when this person's name is revealed, which would you agree is going to happen sooner or later?
I don't know. I thought about that. Yeah, it's going to happen sooner or later. But then again, consider that Deep Throat, that was kept quiet for basically 40 years.
I think we're a lot better at finding out those things. But yeah, I think that though on the right, they're going to say, well, unless it's essentially John Kelly or something like that, that's not a senior administration or a cabinet,
Right.
or a cabinet secretary. It's not senior. So I think it's important to have some sort of a understanding of what we mean by senior. Now, certainly we
Okay.
know some people fall into that. I don't think it's going to be one of the cabinet secretaries. I don't think it's the chief of staff or a deputy chief of staff or anyone quite that high. But I also don't think it's the deputy assistant secretary for wetlands management or something like that.
Right.
So
That's who it is.
yeah, for that person. Anyway, so I guess
I will. Listen to our show. It's like, no, it's not me. I didn't do it.
So I guess I will say provisionally yes, but we'll probably have to spar a little bit about what that means. Fair enough. Okay. Before we move on,
let me just
okay,
one last thing. I just want to throw
yeah,
out the
absolutely.
irony of there's sometimes just weird things happen at the same time,
Sure.
coincidence in life. But the whole, again, with the Cory Booker invoking Spartacus, and wrongfully, right? Because if, the whole point in Spartacus at the end there is the Romans don't really know who Spartacus is.
Right. Yeah, he missed the reference. Yeah, it was
he completely misunderstood. In this case, with the anonymous source, this is exactly where you need to have a Spartacus moment, where this guy stands up and says, "I am." So it just sort of the two trains passing in the night there
Well, it was funny on that point before we move on that I saw a number of accounts where I said, well, it's going to be really hard to find this person because it could be so many people. And I thought,
exactly, yeah.
That's a sad commentary. But anyway, all right. So before we do move on to our next story, we would like to thank our newest supporter, and that is Don, who is our newest monthly sustaining supporter through PayPal. Yeah, you can do that through PayPal or Patreon. And so thank you, Don, for your generous monthly contribution. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Don.
And, of course, when you become a supporter of the show like Don, it's not only that you're helping to keep us going, but you then get access to our special supporters only after show. Last week, Trey and I talked about a federal court's order to redraw North Carolina's congressional districts before the November elections, which, wow, as well as another mass shooting. This week, Jay and I have some great stuff lined up for you as well. So if you'd like to become a supporter, just go to politicsguys.com/support. That's a direct link, or politicsguys.com, and you will see the support the show links there. Thank you very much. All right, moving on. This week, Arizona Governor Doug Ducey named John Kyle to the Arizona Senate seat that became vacant with the death of John McCain. Now, the 76-year-old Kyle served alongside McCain as the junior Arizona senator from 1995 until Kyle retired at the end of 2012. Now, Kyle said that he's willing to serve until the end of the current Congress, at least. So it's possible that Governor Ducey might have to make another appointment if Kyle steps down in January of 2019. And Ducey he's himself running for re-election, though unless there's a really colossal Democratic wave, it looks like he's safe to win another term. I also wanted to point out that in his final year in the Senate, and this was 2012, National Journal ranked Kyle as the 15th most conservative member of the Senate. He was tied with Mitch McConnell, and this is based on voting records. And by way of comparison, McCain was ranked the 28th most conservative that year. So just to give people a little bit of background there. So what did you think about this appointment, Jay?
I think it's good. I mean, I think this is you're putting in someone who is what most people would call mainstream Republican, someone who's been at the job before, is steady, is I would say non-controversial, really. I mean, obviously, Democrats would rather see someone else, but he's not particularly you say he's 15th. Well, that's not particularly a firebrand. He's not Ted Cruz,
right?
So I think it's a good choice. It's certainly a safe choice, and I think Senator Kyle will do fine.
Yeah, and I think certainly the fact that he served in the Senate for so long means he's obviously going to be able to hit the ground running. There's no real
He'll
learning
have
curve.
The relationships,
exactly,
the existing and so forth. Yeah.
Which really wouldn't have been the case for almost anyone else that the governor could have, conceivably nominated or, appointed to that position. So, yeah, certainly I would have liked to have seen somebody who was as moderate as McCain, but that really wasn't in the cards. And, the fact that both Donald Trump, John McCain's family, and Jeff Flake were all well in favor of this move suggests that I think this is probably
this was a thing no one could say no to. If you tried to pick someone else, then you would have had sides jockeying for
exactly
this guy versus this guy. You pick this John Kyle, essentially elder statesman sort of person. No one can really object to it. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, while he's more conservative than McCain, he also has a reputation for being somebody who's willing to not exactly throw bombs, but work together, at least try to work out some things here or there. So, I really think that given the fact that it's that the governor is a Republican, this is about as good as it could potentially get for Democrats, which wasn't going to be that good in the first place.
Yeah.
So,
well, and I would differ a little with you with saying like less conservative than McCain. McCain, to some extent, it's not that he wasn't conservative, or maybe it wasn't conservative, but it was
iconoclastic.
McCain, yeah, it was sort of difficult to determine any particular ideology. I think McCain tended to make decisions not along ideological grounds, but just on sort of what John McCain thought. Sort of at any given moment. So, McCain was probably more conservative than Kyle on some issues, and less so on others. But
yeah. All right. Well, there were a number of tech-related developments in the news this week. Let's see here. First, Facebook Sheryl Sandberg and Twitter's Jack Dorsey testified before Congress, and legislators from both sides expressed concerns about how prepared Facebook and Twitter were to push back against Russian or other outside interference in the upcoming elections. And there were also some Republicans who questioned whether the companies were unfairly targeting conservative voices for removal from their services. Now, Sandberg and Dorsey said they were far better prepared for 2018 than we were for 2016. We don't target based on ideology. We base our decisions about removing content and removing users, which happened to Alex Jones this week on Twitter, solely on our terms of service agreements. Also this week, the Justice Department...
But still, ironically, though, Twitter they still won't identify exactly which policies Jones supposedly violated.
I thought that they did anyway, we can get into that. Yeah. But I'll point out that the Justice Department announced it was going to be convening a meeting of several state attorneys general to discuss whether tech companies are purposefully stifling free speech and obstructing competition. Now, the meeting is reportedly scheduled for September 25th though there's been no indication of which attorneys general are going to be invited. Now, to me, Jay, it seems like there are two issues here. First, the ability of social media and search companies to filter out false and misleading information. And then second, and I guess this is a related issue as well, the issue of whether or not conservatives are being unfairly targeted. So
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on this?
All right, let me take the
take it however you want. Sure,
the second
go ahead.
one first. Are conservatives unfairly targeted? They make the case that, and there's a couple different pieces to this, because certainly I don't think it's any mystery or any secret that the cultures of these big tech companies is overwhelmingly liberal, and we saw that with the guy who got fired from Google for complaining about the culture being overwhelmingly liberal.
Well, before you, let me push back slightly on it. I would say it's more overwhelmingly libertarian. But on social issues, certainly. On social issues, certainly it's
which is why they fired the guy for complaining about it being. Libertarians typically don't fire people for complaining that they're overly libertarian.
Okay, so we'll call it liberal libertarian. Okay, how about that? Okay, fair enough.
No, I think there's definitely that. If you track where the PAC money from these folks go and their CEOs who they support, it flows by and large, if almost not exclusively, to liberal candidates. They live on the West Coast for the most part, which is the most liberal place. So I don't think it's not irrational to say, hey, is there some sort of bias going on here? To me, the second question though is should the government be wading into this? And I would say, as to quote someone on TV, so look, the only person I would trust less than Google and so forth to censor views or decide what's get published is the federal government.
Right.
So for me, from more of a libertarian standpoint, I'd rather that the government just stay out of it. Now, if you want to do hearings and say, hey, look, is everybody getting a fair shake and so forth, I think that's good enough. But if you start talking about we need to regulate this, that will ruffle certainly a lot of my feathers. And I think it's one of those, be careful what you wish for.
Sure.
Conservatives argued for years, and I think rightfully so, against the fairness doctrine in broadcast media. And I don't think we want a new fairness doctrine for the internet.
I agree.
And I think there's something to be said too for, look, I don't know what the secret algorithms are and so forth, and no one really does. But my understanding is, look, and if you do searches, you are going to pull up more liberal stuff. I mean, that's kind of my experience. But a lot of that is based on just because here's what's reported in the mainstream media, which gets the most views, the most clicks, and is sort of then pulled in first, and that tends to be more liberal. And I think liberals just have a bigger online presence than what conservatives do. So I think there are natural reasons why an algorithm would tend to appear to be silencing conservative voices, whether they are doing so intentionally or not. The other thing than Alex Jones, though, of course, what troubles me with that is, Alex Jones is crazier than a bag of cats, right?
Yeah.
And again, I don't think there's any real, discussion, a real difference. And most Republicans, conservatives would agree. Their concern there is, well, if someone says, well, this Alex Jones is absolutely crazy, so it's hate speech or whatever, we're going to shut him off. Is George Will next? That's the.
But of course,
and you and I see a big difference between George Will, and Alex Jones. But I think a lot on the left and folks who run tech companies might not.
But of course, the idea that Alex Jones is this party who has no recourse. I think in any other circumstance, people on the right and hopefully people on the left would say that, well, if he feels that he was unfairly terminated from the service and that he didn't violate the terms of service,
sure.
well then
he's got a contractual right.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's how that should be handled, not to haul the company that did this into congressional hearings and say, explain yourself. That's that seems to me, and I was talking about about this with Trey last week. That seems to be anathema to free market Republicans, certainly,
I would agree. No, I'm with you there. Now, uh, look, I think it's not inappropriate to again, reach out to these tech companies and have them testify before Congress, because we've got situations where here we've got a power that has not been really seen at any time in U.S. history, and it's something completely new. So to say, look, to make sure that power is being exercised responsibly, in both ways, in that we're not getting the Russians, putting up Facebook pages, which will destroy the country. And you're not having crazy Alex Jones too, but
in that, and I think,
so, but again, to me, it's one thing to inquire and to say, what are you doing to make sure that all views are being represented, and another to threaten either explicitly or implicitly some type of regulation.
Well, and that's why I would say that when I heard about that Justice Department meeting, I said, well, I can totally understand the argument to take a look at these companies to see if they're obstructing competition.
From a competition standpoint,
because ideally, in a perfect world, in a perfect market system, competition would take care of these things. If somebody is saying that their voice is not being heard, well, then they can go ahead and create a competitor so their voice can get out there.
If you think CNN is too liberal, well, then
start Fox News. Exactly.
Fox News, create it. Yeah.
Exactly. So I'm on board with that part, but the making sure that companies aren't stifling free speech, that gets me really, really nervous. So
I agreed. Yeah.
And also this week on a tech-related issue, Secretary of Homeland Security Kirstjen Nielsen said this week that, cyber weapons and sophisticated hacking pose a greater threat to the United States than the risk of physical attacks. And she urged states to add more safeguards to their system. She specifically mentioned ensuring that there's a paper trail of every vote cast. I mean, I've been concerned about this for a while, and I think all states should institute this sort of thing. I did a little research on this, and there are currently 5 states with no paper trail voting records: Delaware, Georgia, Louisiana, New Jersey, and South Carolina, and 10 more that don't have paper trails in all of their jurisdiction. And altogether, it adds up to around 20% of registered voters nationwide casting votes without any sort of hard copy documentation. And I think we should be pretty concerned about that. Jay, What do you think?
Yeah, amen. Remember back in 2001, all the Democrats wanted us to be able to vote over the internet?
I think this is the example of unintended consequences. You think something's a good idea, and back then people probably weren't thinking about, the Russians might try to,
It was the whole because after Florida and the butterfly ballot, and darn it, these paper ballots are just too darn confusing. There was a big push that everything ought to be electronic, and then we sort of ended up with, in most places, sort of a hybrid, right? If you've got some sort of paper thing which is tabulated electronically, or something you vote electronically, which is then reflected on a paper. I've been against. I've been for paper ballots for forever, and I'm happy to stick with them.
Now, I think the simplest way to do this, and this is where I maybe disagree with me, the simplest way to do this would be for the federal government to allot the reasonable amount of money to the states to upgrade their systems, but make that money essentially contingent on their instituting a system that has some sort of a paper trail sort of thing. So it would be a grant of money to the states with the condition you have to have a system that does that, because of course the states ultimately get to decide how they run their own voting system, and that's both a good thing and a bad thing. I actually wouldn't change that system, because what that means is it makes it a lot harder to, in a broad way.
You have to hack, instead of having to hack one federal system, you have to hack either 50 state systems, or perhaps even every county within those 50 states.
Exactly. And so I think that's actually, the distributed nature is actually a strength. But I understand where in a lot of these jurisdictions that don't have this backup thing, it seems to me, just looking at the states, tend to be from states who maybe have some resource issues in the first place. And this is not the sort of thing that states are necessarily crazy about throwing a lot of money into for for understandable reasons. And so I think having more money at the federal level given to these states to do this, again, under that condition, would be a reasonable way to solve this problem. Obviously, it's way too late to do that for 2018, but certainly we could do something like that for 2020, and I'd definitely like to see that.
Yeah. Well, I'll say I don't disagree with you there.
Awesome. Well, there you go.
No, because look, to me, and again, as a conservative, I think there are, that wasn't me. I mean, there are certain core governmental functions that we ought to look to the federal government to provide, and this sort of security for the integrity of our voting system, to me, would be one of them. It's kind of right along with national security.
Yeah, absolutely.
Falls in that same kind of category. So.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, that's nice.
That's not to say that they're going to spend too much and the money's going to get wasted and it's going to be sent to the wrong contractors and it's going to take too long and the system won't work anyway. But I'm saying, in principle, I don't object.
Well, in principle, that we can end on that. The principled agreement, though. Of course, I should mention everyone that as soon as we are done recording this show, in just a few minutes, we're going to be doing our special supporters exclusive after bonus show. And I think this week we'll talk about Bernie Sanders' Stop Bezos Act, as well as, Ben Sass's thoughts on Congress abdicating its authority. I thought that was a great op-ed he had in the Wall Street Journal. I know, Jay, you posted
It's like he listens to our show.
You know, it really is. And maybe then also Jay's appreciation of Burt Reynolds, and I think I can appreciate Burt as well. So there you go. If you're a supporter, well, that's going to be waiting for you by the time you hear this, at least if I'm doing my job. If you're not a supporter and you'd like to check it out, again, politicsguys.com/support, or just go to politicsguys.com and click on those support the show links that you'll see there. But for now, that's it for us. Thanks for listening. We do hope you like what you heard. And if you haven't already subscribed to the show, that would be a huge, huge help. Also, sharing episodes, that would be great if you could share this episode with your friends, enemies, people you vaguely know, whatever. That would be awesome. And as would leaving reviews and ratings of the show on iTunes. If you have a question for us, we're always looking for questions, things you think we got wrong, if you need clarifications, what have you, for our listener mail shows, that would be great. We'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. There's also our Facebook page where you can message us when we post stuff throughout the week. That's facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.